Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent.
I can't wait for a coffee. Oh, hello, barista.
What do you girls want?
Skim soy latte?
Taryn, soy can't be skim.
Hot chocolate? Orange juice?
No, Dad, I want a coffee. Hot chocolate? Great.
So, I was thinking of going to Sarah's later. Could you give me a ride?
Yeah, sure. Are you cool with taking your sister?
Yeah.
Wait, what? I have my own plan.
Carly.
Okay, I'll see you tonight, okay?
Carly. How can I help?
Hi, I'm Emma.
Hi, I'm Martin.
Hi, I'm Shelby. We are Youth on Subjects of the World.
Yeah, and today is going to be on Living with Special Needs, and we're going to be interviewing Julie Genovese and Karen Harvey Olson. So, Julie and Karen, do you guys have anything you want to say about yourselves?
Sure. I'm an author and a speaker and an artist, and I'm also a dwarf. I am 4'3", so maybe the size of an 8-year-old. My condition's called spondyloepiphyseal congenital dysplasia. I found out a couple months ago that my strange long Latin name has the same number of vowels or syllables as that Mary Poppins song. And I figure, it's way more fun to introduce it that way than the heavy way that it was as I was growing up. So it was a huge challenge. growing up with those limitations, but I've come to find out it's also a big gift. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Karen?
Hello, I'm Karen, and I'm here today for a couple reasons. I facilitate a group of youth who have special healthcare needs or disabilities, and so I can talk a little bit about that. And also, I have Lyme disease, chronic Lyme disease, and 3 out of 4 of my children have Lyme disease. And in addition to my biological children, we have a young adult with disabilities who lives with us, who's been living with us for since she was 4 years old, and she's an adult now. So it's been a long time, and so I can also share stories of her and the community, and living and taking care of her with her disabilities and special healthcare needs.
Also, she's my mom. So we're going to be talking with you about your experiences and what you'd like to get the word out on. So first, I'm going to ask you, to you guys, what does it mean to obviously you guys are here for a reason, and you are both great advocates for the special needs community, and you've done a lot. So what kind of got you involved in that, Julie?
Wow, that's a great question, because I was born involved without really realizing it. I felt so disadvantaged by being different physically that it just brought me down for many, many years, and it felt like I was broken and I would never be as good as other people who appeared normal, but I come to discover there's no such thing as normal, and we all have our challenges, whether they're hidden or visible like mine. I realized as I got older that it was my own perception of myself that was more in the way of my happiness than my body was. My body had been the thing that was attracting negative attention and teasing and laughter and problems. I thought it was my body. I thought it was my dwarfism, but it turned out it was my accepting other people's opinions of differences, of what limitation really means. My limits physically, because I have arthritis that came with my skeletal structure is different. And so the arthritis posed other limits. But as I got older, I started to realize everyone shares this same feeling of I'm different, I'm not enough, I have to hide those differences. And so when I realized that I wasn't alone the way I always felt I'd been, I wanted to let other people know, because I knew they were suffering the way I had. And it became more and more evident. And as I wrote my book and shared that, I realized even more that we're all part of the human race. We're all so similar in our feelings, even in our thoughts, in the way we want to find happiness and fulfillment. So I wanted to just talk about that and share that, and to help remind myself continually as well, because it's easy to think we're alone when we're really never alone.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. That's really interesting. I can't imagine just being able to think, because I don't have physical limitations, but I am constantly doubting myself, and I can't imagine getting to the train of thought to just accept myself. So that's awesome. So what about you, Mom?
First of all, I have to say I'm so happy to have Julie on this podcast. She is an amazing person, and I've seen her at conferences that I've attended as a parent, and I brought her in as our keynote speaker last year for the youth that I work with for our state conference. She was our keynote, and I just could just sit and listen to her all day. So I'm very happy to be listening to her, and honored to be sharing the screen. What brought me here to the disability, special healthcare need world? When I was 7 years old, I read a book about Helen Keller, who I think everyone is probably familiar with who she was, but she was a deafblind person from the late 1800s into the 1900s. And at 7 years old, I decided I wanted to work with deafblind people. And that's pretty much it. I went to college for sign language, and upon graduating, decided to start my own business because I never do things the way you're supposed to. So I started a daycare for deaf children in my home, or in my mom's home, I should say. And my background was really typical deaf people who had no other disabilities, just used sign language instead of speech. So culturally deaf and really just, ASL, and that being the only difference being the language. And so that's what I opened my daycare for. And really, I was blessed with all of these children with multiple disabilities, where the fact that they couldn't hear, or some that I worked with were nonverbal, the fact that they used sign language was really the least of their concerns or issues. And it opened up a whole world of kids to me, and really kind of started me on the advocacy journey for, I had already been very pro deaf culture and treating deaf people equally, and it's just the language difference. And then really opening up to, people who had far greater struggles, and just sort of helping people, especially children. But the more I've worked with in the field, the more I've started to work with adults with disabilities as well, and especially young adults and youth who are struggling so much for people to listen to them anyway because they're youth, and then, bringing them to the table at things like IEP meetings. And so helping youth with disabilities and adults and children access the world. And it's a passion of mine. And I think it really started when I was really little. And then, having, as I said, the young adult live with us, her first name is Crystal. She's been with us for 20 years. And so helping her navigate the world and see the challenges that she faces. And that's how I got here. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's really cool. So obviously I all knew already that because I'm her son. But yeah, I think it's really interesting how people can just wake up one day and decide they want to make an impact on other people's lives. I don't I've always wanted to help people. I think a lot of people want to help people and want to be kind to people, but I can't imagine just thinking, okay, yeah, I'm going to try and change the world. So how do you guys feel on the perception of people with healthcare needs or disabilities in society? Now it's much more accepted, but especially back then. Julie?
It's interesting because dwarfism, even though it affects us physically and it doesn't generally affect any other capacity, intellectual, and yet I've been treated that way, as if I'm often mistaken for a younger person from behind. So I get the pats on the head, and people are condescending, and so I still feel that and recognize that there's a long way to go for the culture in general to accept that even when we have limits, whether they're physical, emotional, mental, we still deserve, we're still valuable, we still matter. And just because I can't do whatever I can't do doesn't make me less than. And yet I feel treated that way at times. And I certainly see, as Karen was saying, kids are definitely treated that way, as if they're less than. And it's painful to watch. And I feel particularly connected to that because I've been treated as a child, as an adult. And it's very debilitating, or it can be, in the moments when I'm feeling insecure or I'm feeling stressed, because then there's this confirmation from outside me that I'm not as worthy. And everyone battles those feelings of, I'm not enough, and I don't want other people to know the areas where I feel unsure of myself. And yet the more we let each other know, that we're just human and we need each other's help and we're all in this together, the more helpful people are. But I think there's some misunderstanding that those of us with limits or challenges or special consideration, somehow we don't have as much to give the world. And that's really crazy, because I've seen the places where I didn't think I had strength. I found my way around that and found strength in other areas. As soon as I stopped focusing on what I couldn't do, I found out what I could do. And that's true for anyone with any kind of difference. So a lot of my adult friends still don't quite see that. I think it's difficult, and it's something that people need to, have these type of conversations like we're having, to recognize how similar we are, no matter how we start off, what we're born into or what we run into. We are here to gift each other with the presence of who we are as individuals. And that includes wherever we seem to be disadvantaged, we're not. Karen?
Anyone?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Emma.
Well, I have multiple chronic illnesses, and I'm in a wheelchair most of the time because of pain. And see, basically anyone with the type of disability, no matter what it is, there's going to be differences between everyone. But when you're a teen or a child with this, you're already not listened to enough, but then you add illnesses on top of that, and your voice becomes completely invalid most of the time. Because society has all these different barriers and rules about stuff that you don't really notice until they no longer apply to you, or they do in a wrong way. And there are many boundaries and disadvantages that you don't notice if you're normal. Well, not normal, just not sick. Like, I grew up till I was 11, perfectly healthy. Well, not perfectly, and then I got sick, and the world kind of did a 180. So you go into a world of someone who's not ill and someone who is, and the abilities that they are allowed to do and what they're listened to are completely different. So we are given opportunities because we're sick to get the words out and stuff, and some people listen. Healthy people don't get that much. But society kind of sticks us in a dark closet because we don't fit what they want.
So I agree with Emma. I'm lucky Emma is a youth on the council that I help facilitate, and so I get to hear all her great ideas. I have so many thoughts all at once about, awareness, and, you mentioned how do we feel that people with disabilities or special healthcare needs are perceived. I think, people may not realize that disability has its own culture. Disability has a history. Disability has a very rich world of advocacy and strength, but it comes from such a dark, awful place. The people with disabilities have been treated so poorly in our culture and our society, and you'd like to think, oh, well, that was hundreds of years ago. There are places that still have institutions where people with disabilities are sent instead of either being, homeschooled or mainstream educated. And New Hampshire was the first state in the country to close our institution. Yay! And, it feels like, it must have closed, so long ago. It wasn't. It was the early 1990s that the institution closed. And the institution was a horrible place. There's a documentary. The name is escaping me at the moment, but you could probably Google Laconia State School documentary and find it. And it is so disturbing. It is disturbing. So if you do Google it, be forewarned. And, I think it's a great time. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion at all, but it has been a great time for advancement for people with disabilities, for advocacy, for awareness, for acceptance. And I hope that continues. So I think, they're more evident in society. People are involved in communities, involved in community activities. We see them in movies, on television, superheroes. And, I think that is super important. And, my role right now and my, what keeps me working in my job is, I'm an unschooling mom, peaceful parenting mom, and I treat my children with the same respect that I treat everyone else, because I believe children are the same, even if they're smaller, or, Martin's a foot taller than I am, so they're not always smaller. But I think, I bring a unique voice sometimes to the work that I do because, these youth that I work with who have disabilities or special healthcare needs, they're so, like Emma said, they're double whammied. They're not listened to because they're young, and then they're not listened to because they have disabilities. And I'm there saying, you need to be listened to because of those two things, or in spite of them, or whatever way it makes sense. And I want to help you find a way to get your voice out there and to advocate for yourself. And so, the council that I work on, which is called the YA Council, which stands for Youth for Education, Advocacy, and Healthcare. They've created tools and they have a website and all different things where they help other youth advocate for themselves and get their voices out there, because it's really important. And I may disappear for just a second because I can't quite figure out what's going on downstairs in my house. So that's it.
Yeah, and real quick about the YA Council that she just mentioned, me and Emma are actually both members of that council, and that's actually how we met, and that's how that's how we got met. She's on the podcast because I brought it to the council because all of them are youth. And I was like, hey, we're doing this podcast. It's Monday. Who wants to be on it? And yeah, so I think it's awesome to get a little bit more to the point. I just wanted to mention that. But to be a little bit more to the point, yeah, I think it's really interesting because we live in a culture where now people are like hypersensitive of things nowadays. Not everyone, but there's a lot of people who are hyper aware, like really, really, like, especially on the internet, there's a huge culture of people who are just very, very focused on making sure no one gets upset by anything. So do you guys feel that that's good, that there's people who are really aware, or do you think it's not always good because sometimes it doesn't matter, it's not what we should be focusing on?
Well, I don't know that this is an answer or if it is applicable, but there's a thing called people first language. Okay, my children are screaming that my dog is eating chocolate, so okay, they stopped. Sorry. So there's a thing called people first language, and basically it means that people are people first, not a disability. So for example, people who say autistic boy, there's a preference for saying boy with autism instead of autistic boy, because he's a boy who happens to have autism the same way he might have brown hair or freckles. And I, like 98%, totally subscribe to people first language because people are people. I don't walk around saying, oh, that red-haired boy or that tall, short boy or whatever. So why do I have to specify that this person has autism? It's just a characteristic. And then there are a lot of people who the fact that they have autism or another disability is an identifying feature for them, and they want that to be the identifying feature. And they don't like people first language because they feel that their autism is a unique part of who they are. So while I think we are ultra sensitive in our society, and especially the internet highlights that, it is a neat time because of that you can have different opinions and still be supported. Like, I think, and it's also the time that there are more people who are aware and advocating. But you can have people who support people first language and say that that's the only way, and then people who make really eloquent arguments against that. And I'm sure that people are very sensitive about both sides of it. So I don't know that I'm answering your question, but I'm definitely adding more to it. giving an example perhaps of a way that I have not yet been in a room where I was with someone who was pro people first and then someone who was pro, I don't know what they call it, just maybe identifying their disability first. But I would be fairly certain it would be quite an interesting argument because both sides have really, really valid points.
Well, for a while, I was more like kind of disability first because I was little. Well, not little, but I was young when I got sick. And I was born with one of these. I just didn't know I had it. So for a while, I think a lot of people, if they don't really see anything else but the illness, because then they kind of start identifying with that. Because if you're sick for so long and it takes over your life completely, so, oh, I want to get a bed. Too bad you can't because you feel like you're going to puke if you stand up. Because when you're sick, sometimes the illness runs certain parts of your life that you would rather run, but you have no choice because it's not like something that you can negotiate with. So then you start just saying, oh, I have this, or I can't do this because I have that, or hi, I'm Emma, I have blah, 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 because you just don't feel like explaining it anymore half the time. Because if you don't tell people that you are sick, then you can't do stuff, or maybe you're walking around and then you need to take medicine or wheelchairs, or people will look at you weird. But then again, you're a person, you're not your illness, which gets really blurred if you don't really have a choice into trying to figure out who you are. Because if you can't do anything, then it is very difficult to separate you being sick and you being a person who is sick from, okay, I'm not just sick, I'm a person, which then tends to get blurred, and then maybe you can start doing stuff, but you still have the blurred lines. Am I making sense?
Yes, you're making sense. Yeah, like the reason I wasn't responding is because I don't even have something to follow up. I think both what you said just perfectly answered my question. Like, there's a lot of different. I think I think everyone should be, unless it's harming you, okay with what others want for themselves, because there's not just going to be one answer that will define everyone. It's different for everyone because everyone has different opinions, and some people might think this thing and some people might think the other, and it's completely okay for them to both think those things as long as what they're thinking isn't harming you.
Exactly.
And I'm going to steer a little bit away from that for a second. Just say, what do you guys think about people whose disability is not, like, you can't see it. It's in their head, or it's like a heart condition or things like that?
We call that sometimes an invisible disability. I keep answering first, so I'm going to let somebody else go first. But
I also have an invisible disability. I am dyslexic. Mentally, I mix up my W's and M's, and that's about it while reading.
Me
so
too.
I can, yeah, it's quite a, sometimes it was a challenge, but it's gotten better over age. I used to mix up everything when I was younger. So as I got older, it only minimized to M's and W's.
Is it okay if I speak? Because I have an invisible illness still.
Yeah.
So, lots of people, I don't really think it matters whether your disability is something that affects your body, whether you can see it or not, or if it's something that affects the way you think or you perceive stuff. If you ask me, they're both the same, disabling or validation kind of. Because you have dyslexia, but it's not you, but it also affects the way that you learn sometimes. But then people say, okay, just get over it. You have trouble reading. Versus someone who can't walk because they're in pain. Now, you can't see pain unless someone shows you that they are in pain. Which then, of course, virtually responds to other people is, okay, well, I can't see that you're sick, so you must be fine and you're just being a jerk. or you can do this. They both hold the same merit. It's just one people perceive better than the other because it's like, okay, this person is sick. The first thing that people think of when you're sick is like, oh, hospitals, medicine, dying, crutches, wheelchairs. If it's something that affects the way you learn, oh, if you just work hard enough, you'll push past it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, like, it's interesting because people who have problems, like they have a non-physical disability, like sometimes, a lot of times, people just think you're making it up. Like you have anxiety? No, you don't have anxiety. You just get nervous. Like, you're just coming up with a reason because you don't want to address your issues. Like, that's not, I'm sure there's been people who did it, but that's not the majority of it. It's still should be acknowledged the same way nowadays we acknowledge PTSD, but that wasn't acknowledged a long time ago. And it's the same thing with right now. A big one is anxiety. There's a lot of people, especially between the ages of 12 and 30, who are anxious and have anxiety or chronic anxiety or something related to anxiety or depression. And a lot of times people just say, oh, well, just stop being sad, or, oh, well, just don't be nervous. Like, that's not how it works. You can't just choose to, like, there's a lot of people who are just like, okay, well, you just got to think about it differently. But that's not how it works. You can't just change your thought process for it, because that's what anxiety does, or what depression does. It stops you from being able to get out of yourself in order to think things through.
Exactly. And if we could shut it off, we would.
Yeah.
Saying that is basically the same as saying, okay, you have some sort of genetic disorder that's going to screw you over. Just think about it differently and you can do all this stuff.
I think, especially that I've seen with people that I work with, a lot of times the invisible disabilities, the ones that you can't see, they're, like you said, they're much harder for the rest of the world to understand because, they can't see them, which really is like the giant barrier. I feel like there's a barrier with everyone because, okay, so you have someone with a physical disability you can see. Like I have a friend, he's in a wheelchair, he has spina bifida. People are like, oh, he has a wheelchair, so he can't do these stairs here. Oh, but he can get up onto the sidewalk and then we'll go up the ramp. Well, no, he can't get up onto the sidewalk. A wheelchair needs a flat surface, a ramp. Like it can't. So people like think in little increments, or, oh, that person's deaf. Okay, well, I can't talk to them regularly, so I'll get in their faces and shout at them. Like, so there's all these barriers that are there. But I think when there's an invisible disability, it's like the barrier is so big, like people can't even get past it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Lots of the barriers are very negative. So I have something called CRPS, Complex Regional Pain Syndrome, or ISC. I'm not going to explain it, but the gist of it is that my body is getting pain signals that there is something seriously wrong with my leg when there isn't. So I'm in pain all the time. So I'm in a wheelchair most of the time or on crutches, and then all of a sudden, oh, I'm off them now. You get so many looks, and then there's that random person that decides to say something. And people, when you have an invisible illness, it basically means unless you meet a person that's going to wholeheartedly understand, okay, this person is sick even if I can't say it, no one gives a crap, basically. You're sick, I can't see it, so just push past it. Or there's no way you can be in that much pain without basically screaming your head off.
And especially, things like you had said, a chronic condition, some of them, like, for example, I said I have chronic Lyme, my children have Lyme, it goes in flares. So like you can have, 5 weeks where you're great. And I'm lucky. I haven't had a Lyme issue in probably about 6 months to a year. But, I have friends who, we live in New Hampshire. It's very wooded. Everybody here has Lyme, unfortunately. I have friends who, they're great for, weeks and weeks and months, and then they're debilitated and can't get out of bed for days. And then it goes away again. And people have a hard time with that. Well, what do you mean you're having a bad day? Yeah, we all have bad days, but no, Lyme envelops your whole body. It takes over, it, can affect neurological stuff. It affects physical stuff. It affects your stamina, your appetite, like everything. And it comes and goes, but people can't see it. So it's, it's hard for people to believe it or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, because I had Lyme disease, I have Lyme disease, and I was first diagnosed with it 2 years ago after I had kind of like a giant panic attack that kind of debilitated me for weeks, and I was completely out of it, and I was just constantly upset about something or another, and just everything was like upsetting to me. You could you couldn't name a subject that did not upset me in some way for no reason. We went to the doctor, and like I was diagnosed with Lyme and put on antibiotics, and it was still hard at first, but then about 6 months, and I was fine again. And then about a couple months later, I got off of the antibiotics and was fine again for almost a year to the day. And then I had another panic attack and was so much worse than the time before. I was completely out of it for probably about 2.5 months. And then eventually I got back on the antibiotics, and now I'm fine, like 6 months later. But it's one of those things that people are just like, oh, well, what do you mean? Like, you were completely fine for almost a year, and now you're not again? Like, that doesn't make any sense. You have issues that you need to work out on your own. It's not some external thing. And that's not how it works. Like, I can't properly explain what Lyme is. I don't know enough about it. I have it, but I don't know enough about it to really explain a lot of it. But basically, it attacks your weaknesses. So I'm an anxious person, and I have a bad knee. So when I have a Lyme flare-up, I'm debilitated with anxiety, and my kneecap falls off. So that's obviously a very real thing. My kneecap is just not suddenly like falling off because it feels like it. Like, that's something that there's a cause for that. And even when you say that in a conversation, just like I did, there's a lot of people who would just not believe you. Or for me, something I have to do is I can't eat gluten. And as a lot of people here know, gluten, the not eating gluten thing is like a craze for people trying to lose weight a couple of years ago, and it's something that it's a trendy hipster thing. So when I tell people I can't eat gluten, you always get like that downward glance, like, oh, you're one of those guys. Like, and that's very frustrating because hipsters suck. But yeah, but like seriously though, it's very hard because like people associate things without even meaning to. People associate things in their brain with other things. So you can have two things that are completely unrelated, but people associate them, like being allergic to gluten and being a hipster. Those have nothing to do with each other because so many hipsters were very vocal about their ability to not eat gluten a couple of years ago. People associate that in their brain. Like, and it's frustrating. And that is just, it's one of those things that it's not that big of a deal. Like, it's just one of those things that doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things. Like, people confuse me for being a hipster. So what? That's not that big of a problem. But still, it's frustrating.
And the other downside, I think, of an invisible handicap is it's easier to hide it to some degree. And so then the challenge is, oh my gosh, people don't know this about me. Maybe they don't know I have anxiety, or maybe they don't know I have PTSD. And then when it flares up, like you're saying, Martin, people are taken by surprise. But it doesn't make it any less valid. And in fact, it's harder with something invisible. For me, it was hard because mine was visible. That made it everyone else's business. But on the other hand, I couldn't hide it. And that meant I had to make peace with it, I think, earlier in my life than I might have if it had been an internal battle that other people didn't know about. So what I found as I started to share more and more my struggles was that everybody was struggling. And most people understand what anxiety is about. They may not want to admit it as relative. It's good that you do, Martin, because you're going to help a lot of people. I think most people struggle with that, and they struggle with worthiness, and and self-confidence and all of those things. And the more we talk about it, the less it has to be hidden.
Yeah, there's always that like little voice in your head that's telling you everyone goes through this. Like you can just move on. Everyone else does, so you should too. And there's a really, really good video and a very misleading video, and both of them connect. So I've mentioned this a lot on past podcasts. I'm a big fan of the YouTube channel Boy in a Band, and I'm not a big fan of the YouTube channel Prince E. And they had like a little falling out because basically Prince E made this video on depression, talking about how depression is just a state of mind and you can overthink it. And that's not true. That's like, it's wrong. And the things that he says in that video are not fact-checked. They are referencing studies that don't exist and it's just frustrating to watch. And Boy in a Band made a video addressing that, and I really recommend you watch the Boy in a Band video related to it because he shows clips that he emailed one of the leading scientists on depression, and like how it's a chemical imbalance in your brain and it's not something you can control. And he shows clips from that because the guy made a video clip to send to him to post, and it's really interesting. It talks about like how a lot of it's not something you can control. It's not some external force. It's something wrong, and it's not something you could just move past it. And people telling you should just be able to move past it is making it worse. And that, I think that's why awareness is one of the best things for stuff like this. Like, if we have more conversations and more podcasts or more things like this, just that are public and people can watch or listen, and it becomes something that a lot of people are talking about, there's no longer these problems about, obviously there's going to be people who are insensitive or uneducated on the subject, because that just happens. But if we get more people educated about stuff like this, then we'll have less problems.
Now, see, when you have an invisible illness, it is very easy, well, not easy, it takes some practice to hide it. But the reason that you start hiding it is because you're able to, because you are just so sick and tired of the stares and the comments and the people, and everyone's opinion suddenly is like set in stone. And okay, well, if this person says this, or I heard this on the internet, then it must be true. Like, I can't get out of, and also to the other point, like just correlating other things, I can't get out of bed early in the morning because I get really sick. But of course, lots of people correlate that with, okay, you're a teenager, or you just don't want to get out of bed in the morning or not go to school. I can't do it. But it's just like snap, 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 you're a teenager, doesn't matter. Now, see, when you have an invisible illness, lots of people, they don't understand it, even if you explain it, because it's kind of impossible for most people to. Because also, you don't address it. You don't really address that you're sick, and you don't really address your limitations because you don't have to, because other people don't see them. And if other people don't know that you're sick, or they don't notice that you're this sick, it makes it almost a lot easier to ignore it. And I'm talking from experience. I've had this for 3 years. I'm just starting to address the fact that I'm actually sick because I didn't have a choice anymore. When you are sick, you go into this kind of denial stage, I guess, when you first find out that, okay, I'm sick, but I'm still going to be able to do this, or I'm going to be able to do that. And then you slowly realize that you can't. And everyone else can see it if it's visible, but mine's internal. It's with my nerves. And no one can tell what I'm feeling but me. So it's just easier to not tell anyone, and then everyone doesn't like you because you're rude or snappy because you're in pain, and no one will leave you alone. It's just easier to ignore it when you have an invisible illness, because you're obviously going to try and ignore it if you're sick. It's just there's two different levels of what people can see and what people can't. And when people can't see it, they are very mean about it, and they make bad comments, or they just give you looks and they drop you as friends, or they're like, okay, this person's just skipping school, or they're totally crazy and making stuff up.
But being totally crazy, like a lot of people say, like that's still a form of mental illness.
Yes.
Yeah, it's still a thing. Like it's still,
Well,
there's still a problem even if you are making things up.
exactly.
Yeah, like there's,
But
you have,
there's certain levels.
Yeah.
Like that is like kind of a sickness and a disability on its own. Mental issues, that's on its own. But the fact is that they're just saying that this is something that it's different when you actually have something wrong with you. And most doctors, I can tap the doctors that I know on my hand that actually believe this. And basically everyone will automatically correlate, oh, if you just push through it hard enough, you'll get better, or it's all in your head, which of course is its own problem. But when you actually have an illness and no one believes you, it's a whole other set of boundaries and issues, and hiding it because no one believes you. What's the point in telling anyone? Because they're just going to think you're crazy, which, like Martin said, is its own issue. But if you don't actually have a mental illness and no one's paying attention that you're actually sick,
yeah, there's a really big problem around how we view mental illness, especially mental illness. And physical disabilities, we haven't talked as much about that, but there's still, it's not as strong now, but there's still a lot of people assume if you have a physical disability, that automatically means you also have developmental disabilities. When I was very little, learned that's not the case because I grew up in it. So it's weird when you grow up on the other side of it, because my mom, as she's mentioned, has worked with people with disabilities or like anything on that side of it since before I was born. So I grew up, as she mentioned, my not actual biological, but who I consider my older sister, has multiple disabilities. So I grew up knowing there's different forms of different things and the terminology for things and things like that. And I know that, and I just assumed everyone knew that until I was old enough to realize that's not the case. Most people don't know these things. And what do you guys think about that? The fact that people just assume if you have a physical disability, you also have some sort of developmental disability.
It's so that disability, I don't know. Like, I don't even know how to say it. Yes, it's so true. Like, I work with people of all sorts of different disabilities. People who are profoundly developmentally disabled who, at 21 years of age are, functioning developmentally like a toddler or younger. And then, people who are in a wheelchair but are totally developmentally typical. And so often, people are treated the same. They, kind of like a little pat on the head and just the condescending attitude. And even from people who think they're helping or working with them or for them, or however they want to phrase it, like, don't realize that what you're saying is condescending and hurtful. And even if you're coming from the best place, like, try again. You can't make assumptions about people. And I think disability is a place where people really make wild assumptions on all levels. And differences. I'm going to keep saying the same thing.
Yeah, no matter what the difference is, whether it's being physically different or emotionally challenged or whatever way we don't fit into the cultural mold, that scares people. And I know it scared me as a kid when I didn't understand why someone had a singular leg, or why someone was making odd noises, or whatever it was. And my parents were good about explaining that without being awkward or weird or making me feel that they were odd. But that fear of not being part of the pack, I think I challenge people, other people who look different or present in any way that isn't average, is such a challenge for people who want to belong, and they don't want to feel rejected for whatever reason. They want to be a part of either their community, or they want to be a part of their family. They just want to feel like they fit and they matter. And somehow when someone would look out at me and feel afraid, like, yike, there by the grace of God go I. Like, I don't have that problem. At least I don't look like I don't fit. I may not feel like I fit in on the inside, but I can play the part. But the thing is that we all want to belong, and yet we all need to follow our individuality and our individual call. So whatever gets us there is worthwhile. Like looking at what mold we're stuck in, what cookie cutter we've been trying to be a part of, and realize that we don't have to be conformists in order to belong. We can be our individual selves and have our individual differences, whether they're physical, mental, emotional, and still feel a part of the human family.
I think if we can raise children, and I think some of us that are on here are doing that or trying to do that, raise children in a peaceful, loving, accepting way, that has a huge impact on people with disabilities and children with disabilities. And, as a second mother to Crystal, or I always used to joke I was like her dad. She doesn't really have a dad, and I used to have her 2 weekends a month, and like I felt like I was the dad, like it was shared custody. So like as Crystal's dad, I've seen people treat her so horribly. I remember when she was, I think 4, she had a nurse at the time who, unbeknownst to her mother, cut all her hair off. And Crystal had long, beautiful curls, but was non-cooperative is a really light way to put it. It was like wrestling a bear to comb her hair. And so this nurse decided, oh, well, I'll just scalp her. And it doesn't matter. And Crystal is blind in one eye. And so it really accentuated that, the way her eye was. And she is she's still relatively happy, but when she was little, she was very happy. She didn't know that she has congenital cytomegalovirus and all of the things that go along with it. She was just this happy little kid. And I will never forget being in the library. She was, like I said, about 4. And this little girl came up to her and got right in her face and goes, "You're funny looking." And I was never so happy that Crystal couldn't hear, because she had no idea what the little girl just said. And she probably smiled back. And, I think I probably took Crystal's hand, or she was a very tiny 4-year-old. So I probably picked her up and we walked away. But I remember thinking, what is the home environment like that this child didn't come over and say, oh, your eye is different, or, why do you make noise but you're not talking? It wasn't like oh, you're different than me sort of curiosity. It was a negative, you're funny looking, and I think I can tell you that. And it just, it stuck with me so much that, if we can just raise kids to, everyone's different. And some people, I have worked with a lot of kids who are tube fed. And so I've always told my children, some people have 2 buttons. One is a belly button and the other is a Mickey button, and they eat through their Mickey button because they don't eat through their mouths. And, my kids don't think anything of it. And I worked with these twins at one point who were both on the autism spectrum, and also had developmental disabilities. And one of them has since passed away. And I remember having these 2 girls at the playground, and they were maybe 12 or 13, very loud, boisterous, happy being at the playground, like running around. And we went week after week, and a lot of people would stare and, give that look. And then one day a mom asked, what do they have? Not what's wrong with them, not what's with, nothing negative, just what do they have? And I said, oh, they have autism and developmental disability. Oh, and that was the end of the conversation. And I thought, wow, if we could let, more people know it's okay to ask a question. Like, she wasn't coming from a negative place. She wasn't mean about it. And I'd like to think, I was obviously open to the conversation. I'd like to think most parents of children with disabilities, when it's framed in a regular old question, are open to answering and to educating. And then hopefully people will see, it's just a difference. It's not this, thing you need to run away from them on the playground, which some kids used to do. And it would just rip my heart out. And fortunately, they were so engrossed in what they were playing, they didn't notice that people were running from them. But I think, raising children has a lot to do with how disability is accepted in society. I don't remember the original question now.
But I don't think that's always the case where people are open to answering questions. I think a lot of times it's the opposite. Like, I know it's not always the most comfortable situation when someone asks you something like that. But also I think some people, or maybe not some people, but I think a lot of external sources, especially, I'm going to bring up the internet again, think, well, it's not okay to ask that. That's rude. And how dare you? Like, it's horribly, like, you're doing some sort of terrible injustice to ask a question about something. Like, I think that's frustrating because that's how people get educated on it. How do you expect them to be educated on something if you won't offer education for them?
Right.
I used to hate being asked questions because I didn't know the answers. Because in my family, we were very non-communicative about issues. My parents wanted me to feel like I was like everybody else. And meanwhile, the world didn't think that. And so I would I'd back away. I really hated it. I thought they were rude. And then over time, I realized, wow, I actually do need to talk about it. And I do want people to ask. And if the way they ask sometimes isn't necessarily polite, but it's only because they don't know. So I recognize they're not trying to be cruel. They're not even trying to be hurtful. They're really naive and sometimes insensitive, but that's probably because that's the way they were treated. So once we get talking and they'll say, well, so what's the right word I should use? And now people really want to know. Is midget an inappropriate word? It's not the nicest. Like in the little people community, there are some people who feel like that, they call it the M word. It's like the N word,
Or the R word, man, the R word. No way. You do not use the R word.
That's harsh. But there are people in my community who feel midget is as harsh because it was used in such a derogatory way over the years. For me, it's a word. It used to hurt, but now I realize it's just it's another term. And medically, dwarfism is the proper term. And I remember realizing, well, I don't want to be defined by that. So I would prefer to say I have dwarfism, like you were saying, Karen. I'm not a dwarf. But then even that became blurred over the years because I realized I really was defining myself by who I was on the inside and not the outer person. But other people will still define me by my dwarfism, and that's their prerogative. And I don't get bothered by it because, like the Eleanor Roosevelt quote, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And I consented for a lot of years, believing that I was inferior, but I would fight it. And now I realize, if they trigger that feeling of I'm not good enough, then I will need to work on that myself, because there are going to be people out there who are going to think because we're different, because we have this issue or that, we're not as worthy, and that is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I'd say that's a great, I'd say we had a great first hour. So on that note, do you guys want to go to break?
What? Sure.
Break. Oh, Emma?
So I understand both sides of answering people's questions and not answering them because, well, there are illnesses that no matter how much you explain it, people aren't going to get and they're not going to want to get or understand. So it's kind of like pick and choose. So people ask me what this is and I used to just tell them straight off the bat, but then they just didn't understand it or really care, which of course led to issues. And then I just kind of stopped telling people because, again, with this one, no matter how much you explain it, there's not a lot of people that are going to understand it because, okay, well, you did this yesterday, but now you can't get up. So there's differences to it. Like certain disabilities or illnesses, it's positive and it will work out well, and then other ones, it won't.
Yeah. So on that note, do we want to go to break?
Sure.
Okay. We'll see you after the break.
I completely defined myself by my dwarfism, by the things that were wrong, instead of looking at the things that were right.
Julie Brown Genovese was born with dwarfism. For years, she suffered physical pain, cruel bullying, and crippling self-doubt. But she's turned things around, publishing a self-help book and becoming a life coach, which has given her and many others a new lease of life.
I'm a mom, a wife, and a life coach.
Don't feel panicky.
Keep spreading your magic.
I think my job as a coach is to help people find their own truth. It's like the breakdown before the breakthrough. I mean, you need time to give to yourself. It's like the old oxygen mask analogy. You know, we have to put that mask on ourselves first, otherwise we can't take care of anybody.
It's like I gotta figure out a way when I'm not busy working and helping and stuffing to then when I'm not there. It's like I had to find a better balance.
Being born with dwarfism, I grew up thinking I was a genetic mistake, a freak of nature. The type of dwarfism I have is called spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia congenita, and it has affected all my joints. I've had arthritis ever since I can remember. By the time I was 10, I couldn't tie my shoes or put socks on. My childhood, it was challenging. I remember one boy in particular who just liked to target me. This one time I was walking home from school late and he got down on his knees and started walking around me saying, "Look, I'm a dwarf too." And I remember there was spit bubbling out the sides of his mouth. He was eye to eye and laughing in my face. In my 20s, when I started to read self-help books and personal growth philosophy, that's when I started to realize, I'm in my way. I can have as good a life as I believe in. I worked hard to change my belief system from victimhood to empowerment, and it transformed my life. So now I want to help other people do the same thing.
Julie now uses her own past experiences of struggling to accept herself and find love to help others do the same.
Hello.
Hi, Angel. Do you feel like it's limiting your happiness, not having a partner?
When I go anywhere that is couple related,
Yeah.
it's like, wow, I could be part of that, but I can't. People have been like, why don't you try online? I think I'm just so scared of them like actually knowing like, oh, you're a little person. Like, I think I got like a chat the other day that was like, a guy was like, are you really 4 foot tall? Laugh out loud.
Next time I would respond and say, are you making fun of me, or are you just wanting to introduce yourself in a humorous way? Because my sister once said to me, are you assuming that people will all define you by your dwarfism just because you do? And I thought, oh, I am. When my friends, my girlfriends, talked about their crushes and yeah, their first kiss, and I became the one who was supportive of them and excited for them, but no one asked me. I felt, ugh, I don't like this body. No one else is gonna like this body. I met my husband when I was 31.
I love my wife. Well, we met because of a mutual friend that we didn't know we had.
And he said, no, I heard your voice before I saw you. And what I heard was the joy. He didn't see difference. We just felt the connection.
With children, she's amazing. With our kids, she's amazing and has a very long fuse. Because when one's a teenager and one's 12, you need a long fuse.
Remember once when you turned... You've done this twice where you've turned on the blender without the top on.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
It's always fun.
What I like most about her is she doesn't just lie back and say, I'm done or I can't do it.
Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom.
Anytime.
Everything's gonna be okay in the end.
Yes.
If it's not okay,
That is
it's not the end.
right.
Hello, everyone. We are back with Youth on Subjects of the World, and today we have been talking about living with special needs or healthcare issues. So, Mom has a story she wants to share. Here you go.
Thank you, Martin. So as I mentioned, we have a young adult with disabilities who lives with us part-time. Her name's Crystal. She's been with us for 20 years. And I talked a little bit earlier about how it's kind of my passion to make sure that youth, and particularly youth with disabilities, or not just youth, children, everyone, their voice is heard. I say voice in quotations. Their signs are seen, whatever language they use to communicate, whether it's pictures or signs or words. And when I said that, it made me think of a story from when Crystal was very little and she first started with me. She was 4 years old, but had very little language because in addition to being profoundly deaf, she has developmental disability and some behavioral challenges and cerebral palsy, and she's blind in one eye. And she has epilepsy. And so the preschool that she was in a mainstream school that had a deaf program, was used to typical deaf. So children who were just deaf but had no other disabilities. And then they had Crystal, who had all of these things. And so they literally left her in a corner. An aide that was in the classroom did report to the mom at one time that she overheard someone tell her to just leave, or someone told her to just leave Crystal in the corner and not worry about her. They didn't change her diaper. She would be in the same diaper from the morning until she got to me in the afternoons, because she was diapered until she was about maybe 9. And they just didn't want to change it because she was big. And she, as I mentioned, it was like wrestling a bear to comb her hair. It was like wrestling 25 bears to change her diaper. It was an uncomfortable experience for her. And she would kick and flail, and there was a lot there. So she was kind of ignored, and she came to me, and I was, early 20s, invincible. I can do anything, and this is going to be wonderful. And just absolutely fell for this little girl. And one of the first things that I did was teach her that she could say no. And so she had not had an ability to say no prior to this in her life. Her only way to say no in a situation was to throw herself on the ground and flail around, kicking and screaming and crying until the situation passed. And so I remember realizing if I really, really quickly signed, oh no, oh that's okay, in her face before she threw herself on the ground, that eventually she started to realize, oh, she's not making me do what was asked. She actually is giving me the ability to make a choice here. She'd never had that. And so we were at her IEP meeting after she'd been with me for a couple months. And I mentioned to the school that one of the things I was working with her on in my program, which was never very popular with the schools because it wasn't affiliated with anyone. It was just me in my house or my mom's house. that I was working on, teaching her to say no. And the school was horrified. Well, what do you mean you're teaching her to say no? I'm like, well, she's a person and she should have the right to say no if she doesn't want to do something. And they were just, that was not a choice for them. And they were furious that I was teaching her how to say no. And it really highlights, I think, how a lot of people with disabilities are treated, unfortunately, that the choices are taken away from them. And I think we're working really hard on person-centered planning is terminology from the field, but that we're trying to make sure these kids and these adults with disabilities are able to use their voice. But I thought it just showed a really just an interesting story of trying to help her learn her voice. And she did learn to use no, and she uses it quite effectively now. And she used to, when she was little, she doesn't do this anymore, but she used to ask questions that she knew the answer was no to with her eyes closed, because as a deaf person, she can't see the answer if her eyes were closed. So she would be in my kitchen, and look outside in the backyard in the middle of the snow at 9 o'clock at night and ask me if she could go swimming, but she would sign it with her eyes closed because she already knew the answer was no, but she wanted to do it anyway. And it was just really funny. So there's my story.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. It kind of draws back to what we were talking about earlier, how people just assume okay, well, if you're deaf, you have a disability or you don't. Like, you can't have a physical disability and not have a mental disability, but you can't have, you can be able to be blind or deaf, but that means you can't have any sort of other disability. There's no in between. You can't have multiple things. You have to be one or the other. You cannot be both. And we talked a lot about that earlier, so I don't know if there's anything else anyone wants to say about that.
Or if they see someone in a wheelchair and then they see them getting up to get over a curb or something, they just can't comprehend it because it's this person's in a wheelchair. They're not supposed to be able to get up.
Right. It's it's supposed to be 100% or 0. They don't understand that there's varying degrees of, I can step 3 steps, but that's about all I can do, kind of a thing. Or I can transfer from my wheelchair, but I can't walk around or run a marathon. People are interesting.
Yeah. So that brings us into another thing we wanted to mention. Is it okay to ask for help? If you see someone who has trouble doing something, they have physical limitations to do something, or limitations to do something, not just physical, is it okay to offer help, or are you supposed to wait if they ask for help, or is it rude to not ask for help? What is the proper thing there, or do you think it's just personal to each person?
It doesn't bother me at all to have someone offer to help. Anne's example, when I'm in the grocery store, I can't reach, most of the stuff. And I'd say a lot of the time, someone will walk by me, and if they see that my eyes are up, they'll say, "Is there anything I can reach?" And I always really appreciate that. Most of the time, I'm just scanning, and I don't need their help. But I like that, they notice, and they're not saying there's anything wrong with me, or I don't feel that's what they're saying. They're just being a human, saying, "Wow, she's really short. She probably can't reach that. Let me give her a hand." But when I was younger, I didn't like it, so I can see both ways. There isn't one pat answer that everyone with some kind of disability or special needs would appreciate the offer. It's going to be dependent on the situation. But I think most people are really good-hearted, and even if they say it in a way that is a little awkward, they mean the best. Or at least that's what I've run into.
Me personally, I don't, you can talk if you want.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, me personally, I really hate it when my mom asks someone to hold her door or something, just because, I'm already the kid in the wheelchair. I really hate attention. So that's me. But if someone offers, I'll let them do it because I obviously do need help. It's just I won't admit it.
I think it's very situational. and how it's done. It can be done in a very kind and sorry, did I disappear? Am I there?
You just
here. Okay, my phone rang. It can be done in a very kind and helpful way, and it can be done in a really icky and condescending way. And I think it really is situational. It depends on the person with a disability, and it depends on the situation. Like, you know, I have one young adult that I've worked with for 10 years on the council, and she had a saying once that we used at a conference that somebody had asked her if she could use a hand, and she said, yes, you can applaud for me when I do it myself. Because she really was able to do much more than people thought she could, and she would rather take a little bit longer to do it on her own than have someone step in. And so, you know, for me personally, if I see someone that I feel like is maybe struggling or trying to do something, I kind of assess the situation. Like, do they have a family member nearby? Do they have a provider nearby? And what's their comfort level? Like, do they look like they're struggling, or do they look like they're ticked off at the person that isn't understanding them, but they're in control of the situation? So I think, you know, you can assess the situation and then, you know, in a helpful, friendly way, the way you would say to anyone, you know, that you had their arms full or that had dropped something. Oh, you know, do you need anything? As long as, well, you know, it's apparent that you're not coming from an icky, condescending place. Or like, you know, and I think it's different sometimes if it's a family, like a mom and a child with a disability together, and you're kind of trying to swoop in, like that really, you really have to come from the right place for that. Like Crystal, one of her issues is she's got very poor oral motor function. So choking and vomiting are pretty regular occurrences for her, especially when she was little. My husband probably did the Heimlich on her 25 times in the first couple of years we had her, because she didn't have bilateral tongue movement, so her tongue didn't go back and forth, and you had to tell her to chew and you had to tell her to swallow, or none of those things happened. And so she would kind of cough and gag, but you could tell, like, kind of do an assessment. Oh, she's going to be fine. Or, okay, yeah, stand up and give her the Heimlich. And I remember us being, you know, in a restaurant and she was doing sort of a gaggy coffee thing, and we were looking at her, and okay, we knew she was fine. And the people around us were pretty horrified that, you know, oh my God, your child is choking, because people always think she's ours. And, you know, your child is choking and you're not doing anything about it. And how dare you, because we know better. And we were kind of like, she's with us all the time. This happens on a daily basis. Like, we're not going to let our kid like choke to death at the table. We're aware of what's going on, you know, and you know, people just have to be aware that sometimes help is needed and sometimes it isn't, and you have to be careful when you're offering, and that you're coming from a place of equality with that person, not like, oh, I'm better than you, so I'm going to help you. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
I kind of agree. It's definitely a situational thing, depending on what they need help with. And, like, if there's anyone nearby, I would personally ask. But you definitely have to look at the situation before you go ahead and ask.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of people ask me, is it okay if children walk up and ask questions? Or is it okay if adults ask you, what's your condition? Or what words, what labels do you accept? And it's always different. But I have said to them many times that you have to check in your own gut, look at who the person is, see if you make eye contact or not. I think that says a lot, because I used to look away as a kid, or I'd look at them and go, you know, I clearly meant like back off, and then people would still come at me. So I think our whole culture needs sensitivity training. Reading what's going on inside ourselves. There's a lot of signals for what's happening in someone else, because we're connected on a deeper level, and we just need to learn how to go there and to realize what's going on, so that we don't judge. You know, say if Emma, you get out of your wheelchair, if people are really checking in and realize, of course, there are a lot of situations where people are in terrible nerve pain or There's so many conditions that require a wheelchair, and yet they still can get out. But they may not know that. People don't know that. They just need you to inform them, and then next time they might be more sensitive to the next person.
Well, I think that if it's like a little child that doesn't know any better, that's obviously fine. They don't know any better, but like if it's an adult and they come randomly out of the blue, or someone that I don't know, or just another kid in the school that's in a higher or younger grade than me, and it's like a long explanation. And I got so very sick of explaining it, so I would just say, my nerves are messed up. Which is kind of accurate, but it's not really informing anyone, because there's the whole awkward thing of, I don't know this person, and they're asking me to explain why I'm like this, and I don't know if they're going to judge me or be a good person.
Right. So you're in a vulnerable position, and they're just, just asking a question. They don't realize they're putting you in a position of, like, ripping your heart open, giving them information maybe you don't want to, and you certainly don't have to. It may make you feel better over time to tell them the full story every time and just blah, 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 blah. Or, it'll come out differently each time. But it's how you feel about it that counts the most.
I find that sometimes especially with my children with Lyme, Lyme can cause a lot of behavioral issues that my kids didn't have prior that now they have. And so, something they could have done on their own 2 years ago, now they're terrified and freaking out and crying about, not sitting next to me at the restaurant or something. And I feel the need sometimes to say they have Lyme disease, because I want people to know, I guess, like what, first of all, Lyme awareness, I guess, because people have no freaking clue what it entails. But just to kind of explain, what's going on, like, maybe a little more sensitivity from the person if they understand that, oh, this kid's not a brat or whatever, like they're not in control of the situation. And one of my children he is having a horrible Lyme relapse, and I have really sort of been treating it more as like a behavioral breakdown, I guess. And he had just a meltdown at the chiropractor a couple weeks ago that was just unbelievable. And the chiropractor took me aside. She's like, get him in treatment. And he's not in control of what he's doing. And I was kind of like, oh, right. This is Lyme. Oh, yeah. So, like letting people know the symptoms of different things sometimes can, I think, just sort of ease the situation. For me, it was a nice reminder of, oh, that's right. Like he needs my understanding here, not me being like, oh my God, what are you doing? Because he wasn't in control of the situation. So,
but then there are the people that pain, it makes you act differently, or really mean, or ignoring people, or there's all different things because you're in pain. You're gonna act differently. Ow. And you don't really feel like, you can't explain how you feel, and even if you say it, it's not going to make a difference. So you start snapping at people or yelling at them, and they're just viewing you as a bratty teenager yelling at your mother. And sometimes even your parents are like, well, it doesn't matter, you can't yell, because they're just so used to you being in pain so much and you being like this, and people still don't understand, because you're still, even if they know what it is, because they're still just like, well, you're going to be like this the rest of your life. Get a grip. Kind of. Obviously a lot nicer.
I should hope so.
Okay, awkward silence there. That hasn't happened yet. So,
yeah.
A lot of times I think it's interesting when we have a podcast, there's a lot of blank spaces in between people talking. And I've so far on this show
That was the first.
That was like the first one. There has been no, I think that's really interesting that this is a subject that has so much to talk about that it takes an hour and 25 minutes before we need to pause to get a breather. Like, I mean, it's not a lot of people like to act like they know about it and like they talk about it without actually knowing about it. I think that's very common where people want to think that they know more about it than they actually do. And I don't know if this happens to anyone else, but it frustrates me a lot when people act like they know more about what you have than they do. Like that's very frustrating.
Yeah, talk to moms in the disability world, and man, they would like be patting you on the back and giving you the thumbs up because oftentimes they know more about their child's disability than the doctors, the specialists, the school personnel who are making the decisions and telling them what's what, but they live with the child, 24/7, and they know the ins and outs of, you can give someone a diagnosis, but a diagnosis doesn't explain everything. Like I always tell people to get to know the child, not the disability. Like, yeah, you need to know what disability they have if you're working with them or you're, treating them or whatever. But that doesn't mean that because they have, Tourette's that they are going to look like this and this and this and this and this. Each person is an individual and has, every disability has variations within it, but humans have variations. So, no two people with a disability look the same just because they have the same diagnosis attached to them. So yeah, moms are constantly echoing that, it's really frustrating when people are, trying to tell you what's what.
And then there are diseases that not even the doctors know what they are, even when you tell them. Like, I can probably say I've been been to about maybe 40, 50 doctors that don't even know what my disease is, or all of them. Like, the only one that they always hear of is my genetic disorder.
Yeah, it's like Lyme disease. People don't believe in that.
People, I have had so many people not say it directly to me, but just be like, oh yeah, that's not a real thing.
Yeah. Oh, take 2 weeks of antibiotics and then you're fine.
Yeah, like a lot of people, I'm not going to mention names, but there are some people I know who are very, very prone to not believe and to just think it's a product of the fact that my mom is a hippie. And so there you go. My mom's a hippie. That means this is some made-up disease, some hippy-dippy, I live in the woods bullshit that doesn't actually exist. And that's very frustrating because it's acknowledged by some doctors and not by others. But I have antibiotics from my doctor. Like, it's not like I'm stealing this. It's not like I'm getting over-the-counter things. It's not like I self-diagnosed. I have a diagnosis from an actual doctor. I'm not making it up. And that it's very frustrating that people just, like I said, assume they know more than what you know, or assume you're lying, or assume you're making something up.
People also get assumptions, I think, from the media too. Like, not necessarily about Lyme disease, but, I think when autism first made its way into the mainstream world, it was people who were like incredibly, exceptionally smart or gifted in one area, but had, a lack of social skills or whatever. And while that can be an occurrence in some people with autism, it's by far not the commonplace. But you'd see everyone expected Rain Man if somebody was diagnosed with autism. Oh, well, what's their special skill? What do you mean? They don't necessarily have a special skill. So
X-Men,
right? People, I think, take things from the media, or, if you watch, for a little while, Marlee Matlin, who's a famous deaf actress, she won an Oscar for her role in Children of a Lesser God. She did some mainstream television shows where she would sign, but she would also lip read, and she would lip read when the people's back was to her. And I was always like, their lips aren't even facing you. Like, you are doing the deaf community such a disservice by making people think that, A, people can lip read. The best lip reader gets like 50% of a conversation. And B, that people can lip read when they can't see lips. So, like, people think all of these things, they see it on TV or they read it in a book and they think, oh, well, that's, that means, that goes along with this disability or whatever. And it's, like I said, everyone's an individual.
And then, of course, there are the disabilities the things that are published by doctors. It's absolute swear word. Like mine, half their theories, there are literally 3 things that you can do for this that help people. And there is no cure. So there are pain clinics, which are basically torture facilities. And I mean, if it works, I'm not trying to criticize any specific thing. It's just my opinion. Basically, with this disease, if this type of treatment works for you and gets your pain down, by all means, do it. And don't listen to the rest of us. But I mean, they take away your medicine and any device that you need help walking, and they make you do everything that makes it hurt. And like, if you can't touch your skin because it hurts, they make you do that and walk. Doesn't matter how sick you are. Or they treat it like it's a psychological issue, which of course it's its own, those are their own issues themselves, but they make people think that if you get enough counseling, this will go away. It won't. And then there are infusions, which most people don't believe works because some random person found out that it did, and now lots of people do it, and it helps them. That was my dad.
Hi, Dad.
Totally random. So,
Hi, Emma's dad.
Yeah, so then the articles that they publish from doctors or the people from the hospitals that are popular, like there's a hospital in Boston that are supposed to be #1 leading. They didn't do anything to help me at all. And just let me get to the point that I couldn't stand anymore. And they published all these articles or have newspaper clippings or interviews, and it's only the positive stuff, what they think works, and there's no negative thing about any of it. So even the stuff that you read, it's not always accurate, even if it's by doctors.
No, because doctors have their own agenda about, being published or being supported by the pharmaceutical companies or the insurance companies, and they don't necessarily, I felt very unsupported by doctors most of my life. I think it's getting a little better, their bedside manner and their sensitivity, but wow, they have a long way to go. And you're going to be hopefully at the forefront of teaching them how to treat you like a human, even though you have issues that they don't understand. It doesn't make it that it's not real. It's very real. And there's just, the human body is an incredible machine. There's so much to know, but you as a person are more important than any of the symptoms that they're looking at.
Yeah. I've had doctors that are just, I go in for one appointment and they're just like, yeah, you're too complicated. Go away. You'll ruin us. Mm. Of course, they don't say it like that.
Right. No, you're right. I've been to specialists who had never worked on someone with my skeletal situation, and they were very dismissive. Instead of saying I'm not capable, they attempted to help me, and I realized later I should have just moved on right away. But their own ego got in the way, and they saw an opportunity. Ooh, I get to work with a new condition. But it really wasn't in my best interest, they weren't being realistic about that it wasn't their specialty either, but I had to go there because of my insurance or whatever it was. So everywhere I go, I now see myself as in the role of teaching them that they don't necessarily know more. They very often know less than I know about my own condition. And so I don't go in as if I'm their patient. I go in like, well, we might be partners, but I probably know more about it. And you know about certain things, and we may just have to get past this insurance thing so I can go to the person who actually can help. It's complicated, and the system has become complicated because of all the money involved, unfortunately.
Yeah, but most people don't. I think that what most people, well, people, unless you're really ill with a certain type of illness that doctors don't really know how to help you, they just automatically think, okay, it's a doctor. They know what they're doing. They know how to help you, or they're not going to not know what this is, or it's just so much things surrounding doctors that just makes you think they know everything. They can fix you. They're always going to be in your best interest, which isn't always true. And of course, I'm not trying to I've lost the word. Like execute doctors or like going to them or anything, because I mean, they're doctors. They know more than you about lots of things, but certain things they know absolutely nothing about, which can be very frustrating.
It is. We talk a lot on the youth council about, how to talk to doctors and, always remembering that they're people and they have bad days at work and good days at work. And, they know some things really well, but that doesn't mean that they know everything, and that it's okay to get a second opinion on things. And, a lot of the youth I work with, we're working on transitioning them from dealing with their pediatrician to dealing with their adult doctor. And, they have these healthcare needs that they've been managing with their families their whole lives. And now they're really working on taking that care over on their own. And that's a whole new, that could be a podcast unto itself. But, remembering that they're a human being and that, you don't want to be rude to them, and you do want to, like you said, work together as partners, but you do know more. If you've been living with this condition for 18 years and you're walking into a brand new doctor's office, like they need to understand that you're coming from the place of expertise on your illness. And, we have tools and tips on our website for how to kind of talk to your doctor about, working together on your healthcare. And especially, there are a lot of health issues that children were diagnosed with, that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, children didn't make it to adulthood with them. And so adult doctors didn't know how to treat some of these illnesses or manage some of these illnesses because they never had to. And now we've made a lot of advancements, thank God, in pediatric medicine. But now you have all these adult docs who are getting patients with conditions they've never seen before. If you have a child who, has lived their whole lives with, cholesterol issues or cardiac issues, they're not the same as late onset cardiac issues that you would see in an older person from, a lifetime of eating steak and never exercising or whatever. It's different than someone who's born with a congenital cardiac issue. And so, yeah, like navigating the world of medicine when you have a special healthcare need or disability is a whole different ballgame. Like, if you want to, there's a lot of things on video clips you can find on YouTube around how to talk to patients with disabilities. If you have a patient with a developmental disability who brings their parent with them, that doesn't mean you talk to the parent. You don't know that the parent is the guardian just because the child has, Down syndrome. Like maybe they're perfectly capable and are their own guardian and they want their parent in there just to help them remember. Or maybe their mom was their ride and that's why they're in there. And it has not, they have nothing to do with the appointment. So it's a whole other thing there.
First of all, I just want to address what person spends their whole life eating steak and never exercising?
People.
Are you thinking of? Are you thinking of?
No.
Okay.
No, I wasn't.
Okay, just making sure.
No.
Okay. So I just wanted to kind of steer clear a little, like take a different turn. So what do you guys think of the misdiagnosis, or not necessarily misdiagnosis, but overdiagnosis of things like autism and ADHD in children in the school systems nowadays?
Me. Can I talk?
Yes.
I think so many things about this. And I'm speaking now as totally as myself, not in any professional manner. There is a massive overdiagnosis of issues like that are often children being children, children who might need a little more physical activity, maybe have some sensory stuff going on and they need a different type of seat. And so they're physically uncomfortable, but that manifests as a lot of wiggling, which therefore is going to get them an ADHD diagnosis. Or maybe they didn't have a sufficient breakfast and they're hungry. And so they're really distracted by the fact that they're hungry. Or they're allergic to something in the room and their nose is constantly running, but they're going to get a diagnosis of ADHD. And I know a lot of, in our family, we say quirky individuals who, 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago even, were diagnosed as quirky individuals, or not diagnosed, I should say. They were just seen as that quirky individual, and life went on. And nowadays, anyone who is a quirky individual, I shouldn't say anyone, because obviously there's always, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, there's always, exceptions to every rule, but most people now are diagnosed with autism if they're quirky at all. And Martin and I have been discussing a lot lately, labels, and how labels can be very helpful sometimes, and labels can be a real detriment sometimes. And I feel like the autism label is one where, clearly if you have someone in what I would call, in my clinical world, like a real classic autism where there's no eye contact, maybe they're nonverbal, really don't know what to do in a social situation, have a lot of verbal, like echolalia, or doing some, self-stim behaviors, that's a classic autism. They need a label because they need some support. They're not going to get a job. They need maybe a day program or some supported employment, or, support at the community college level or whatever. But if you have someone who is just socially awkward and maybe really into, one kind of a toy, and really is kind of hyper-focused on that, and we'll talk more about that in conversation than other things. But really, other than that, they're pretty okay. They might be a little socially awkward, but, if they're not horrible. They know how to make conversation. They know how to get through their day or whatever. That slapping a label on them, you're funneling them into a system that is going to be a detriment. Like Sheldon. If Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, nowadays, if he were a kid, they'd label him on the autism spectrum, and he would be funneled into a system. He would not be a doctorate of physics and living with roommates and have a cool girlfriend. So that's I could go on for hours, but I'll stop.
But a little different about this, but still kind of the same topic, I guess. There are the people who know that this child might have an issue or something similar to autism, but the child doesn't know. So then they find out when they're older and no one talks about it. And then they find out that they're older, that they have this, and they just thought they were weird. Which is kind of personal experience for me. I have NVLD debate around that. I basically know nothing about it, because until last month, I didn't even know I had it.
Yeah, we've actually talked about that, Martin, and I have a friend who, thought she was normal until someone told her she had autism, and now she wonders if now she feels that label holds her back. And I feel like that, can be the situation. Like I said, some people need a label because now they know, oh, that's why I feel this way, or whatever, or now I can go get some services. But also, it can be a detriment if you have someone who says, oh, now I have that label, so now that's who I am, instead of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, they can be negative, or they can be a little better, because this kid might not be able to understand a certain thing or develop the skill faster than everyone else. And no one says anything else, so they just think they're off, or they just can't figure it out, which of course isn't that much of a bad thing. Some people just figure things out slower than other ones, but I mean, you're going to criticize yourself. It's the nature of a person.
Yeah. So I would love to talk about this for another 2 hours, and I think we definitely need to schedule another podcast on this subject, because there's so much to cover here, and we only got to cover this much of it. But I had a lot of fun, and does anyone have any closing statements they want to have? I want to say, not want to have.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Treat everyone like a human being, no matter how different they are.
Just because you can't see someone being sick doesn't mean they are.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for watching. This has been Youth on Subjects of the World. I believe we have some interesting things coming up in the next couple weeks, and we hope you tune into those. And yeah, thank you. This has been Youth interviewing Julie Genovese and Karen Harvey Olson.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.